All right. Thanking God again for clarity. Let's call this chapter Joel chapter 3, the last chapter in the book of Joel. What are you to me? A question that God is going to pose to people, specifically Israel's neighbors at this time, as he's going to seem to give us a clear picture of what it's actually going to look like as he is restoring the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem. Understanding that that question of what it's going to look like is going to seem to form the structure of the chapter as we work towards, God willing, a better understanding of that question. What are you to me? A question he's posing to Israel's neighbors, but a question that's going to likewise seem to be relevant to all God's people. As verse 1 is going to begin. For behold, in those days and at that time, when I restore the fortunes of Judah and Jerusalem, I will gather all the nations and bring them down to the valley of Jehoshaphat. I almost thought of calling it location, because two times he's going to talk about the valley of Jehoshaphat, and then once additionally, he is going to talk about the valley of decision in verse 14. Location is going to be huge here because much like we saw with places like Jezreel and Gilgal in the book of Hosea, this chapter, which is going to end up the book of Joel, is going to talk about God bringing full circle some blood that he had not yet avenged. However, going on in the structure of chapter 3, he is going to ask, as we have already mentioned, from verses 4 through 8, what are you to me? Specifying that question to places like, or nations like Tyre and Sidon and Philistia. Understanding that as we move forward to the book of Amos, it's going to take roughly the structure that we saw in the book of Isaiah, understanding that Amos comes closer in time to the book of Isaiah. He is going to deal with the judgment he is bringing to his people, Israel, and the nations, all in a sequence of chapters in Isaiah and all in a sequence of verses in the first chapter of Amos. And so likewise, this question in some ways is similar to a question that Jesus posed to his own disciples when he talked about certain catastrophes that happened to some folks, challenging them to think, were they worse sinners than those who were still walking around? He says, but take the lesson and understand, unless you repent, you will all likewise perish. And that seems to be the mistake that Tyre and Sidon and Philistia have made, seeing a day when Israel is going to fall into misfortune, failing to realize that if they commit the same wrongs, the same misfortune is going to happen to them. A consistent lesson throughout the prophets that God is now directing at these particular neighbors of Israel. But like we said, as you go into Amos, it's going to come back full circle, understanding that likewise, it's the same message for his people. Don't look at the judgment of the nations and think, like Revelation 18 says, that if you share in their sins, you won't likewise share in their plagues. As it goes on to say, even though there are times, verses 9 through 10, where God is going to call his people, particularly once again in Isaiah, to beat their swords into plowshares. This time it's the reverse. He's saying this is a day of judgment for which they should consecrate for war. In verse 10, some of the things that they had dedicated to farming or just doing their daily work. Verse 10 saying, beat your plowshares into swords. Verses 11 through 12 saying, hasten to come, talking about the way that he is baiting them into a trap. In a lot of ways, is through their own appetite. So to the degree they think they will be able to take advantage of the vulnerable, this time the vulnerable among God's people, that's actually the bait through which God is luring them into their own destruction. Similar to what we saw in Ezekiel, I believe, chapters 38 and 39, where he assembled Gog as a great army against God's people, only to make Israel a burial place for that great army and offer God's people the opportunity to plunder those who planned to plunder them. As he's going to go on to say, it's time to put in the sickle, for the harvest is ripe. It's time to go in and tread, because the the wine press is full. The vats overflow, for their evil is great. Imagery that seems to connect to Revelation 14, talking about the treading of the grapes of wrath, the winepress of God, verses 14 through 16, going on to talk about, as we mentioned before, the valley of decision, wrapping up that context or that sub-theme we mentioned of location. The place in which they planned to plunder or do dirt was a place where they ended up getting done dirty. a recurring theme in God's days of judgment. Understanding once again that verse 14 specifically describes this as the day of the Lord, or saying that the day of the Lord is near. Verse 16, however, saying that the day will provide a refuge to his people and a stronghold to the people of Israel. Verses 17 through the end of the chapter, verse 21, seeming to give us a therefore statement, saying, so you shall know that I am the Lord your God, who dwells in Zion, my holy mountain, and Jerusalem shall be holy, and strangers shall never again pass through it. Verse 18 going on to talk about the abundance that we've seen before that will happen in the day that God restores the fortunes of his people. Verses 19 through 21 concluding, as we mentioned before, that this marks the place or the occasion where God will avenge blood that he had not yet avenged. I have a footnote that actually says one of the translations of this verse actually talks about acquitting blood guilt. However, while the Bible talks about forgiving all kinds of sins, including killing, it's dangerous to interpret the Bible as offering permission to do wrong, recalling Paul's warning, shall we sin that grace may abound? Certainly not. Reminding me of the question that I said he is posing to Israel's neighbors here, but it's probably a good question for us all to consider, that being verse 4. What are you to me? Or maybe stated another way, on the day in which God restores the fortunes of his people, who are we? Understanding that Christ described his people as his sheep, those who, regardless of their appearance or what they might outwardly project, as we say from time to time, are taking on the characteristics of the meekness, the honesty, the integrity, the genuine concern for all his people that they see demonstrated in the life of Christ, the very character traits that many see as the characteristics of a great victim, which is quite possibly why Christ warned about our vulnerability in the world, but also our vulnerability to those he described as wolves in sheep's clothing. One of the reasons he quite possibly cautioned his disciples to be as wise as serpents, but as gentle as doves, helping us to understand that the wisdom he's calling his people to is not just the wisdom to understand the motives of those around us, but to also be wise as to our own motives, understanding that one of the dangers of drawing near to Christ is settling for a position that is merely Christ adjacent without fully being committed to adopting his character, which is why God's question in verse 4, what are you to me, seemed like it was not only a great question for Israel's neighbors, but a great question for all God's people. Understanding the way that verse 17 reminds us that, for lack of a better term, he's always designed Jerusalem to be ground zero for holiness. And even though the characteristics of holiness can seem to make God's people square or simple or vulnerable to those with ill motives, chapters like Hosea 3 remind us that even though it may not always be easy to see, God dwells amongst his people, hunting those who would hunt and mislead them.